Joe Price sat at his desk, trying for the third time in a row to lift his coffee without spilling a drop. The trembling of his right hand was almost imperceptible until he had to grab the handle of the mug. The coffee began to splash in the mug and again threatened to overflow. With a crash and a sigh, he set the mug down on the now wet surface of his desk and leaned back in his chair. He closed his eyes and tried to relax. All it achieves is to bring back memories, like an old movie, a little jerky, lacking in color, and with out-of-sync sound. "Congratulations," came a voice from the loudspeaker, and the crowd erupted into applause and cheers. Joseph A. Price, second lieutenant, stood at attention. He was now a fully qualified engineering service officer, EDO, who would become commander of the Philadelphia shipyard 20 years later. In the old days, this position would have been called a ship's master, but like many things in the Navy, tradition was lost along with outdated technology. In his early years, Joe was the last EDO qualified in steam engines, the next qualified in jet turbines. In Joe's opinion, this was a significant step back in reliability, but whoever asked his opinion. His ship tour as a lieutenant was assigned to Fibron 6 aboard the S. Saipan. He was assigned N4 Fibron, but due to his 1T4-840 designation, he was temporarily transferred to the Saipan Engineering Department. Contrary to the warped conventions of the U.S. Navy, the ship's engineering department did control the ship's engines. In this case, two 600-size steam boilers geared turbines producing over 60,000 horsepower to propel the hull through the water. But according to tradition, the stokers, the men and now women who stood watch and controlled the demons known as cauldrons, were called the Black Gang. This was not a racist label, but an acknowledgement of the old days when coal was king and everyone, including people, was saturated with coal dust and soot. One of Joe's proudest moments was when his department head asked him if he wanted to walk around the tank. This was Joe's rite of passage and meant that he was truly accepted into the gang. One of the deep fuel oil tanks was cooled from its normal temperature of 200 plus F to room temperature. The oil began to resemble summer bitumen on the roof. You could walk on it, but if you stopped, you would begin to sink. Joe entered the tank by climbing down one of the inspection ladders, walked across the surface of the oil, a distance of about 60 feet, and climbed out of the tank using a Jacob's ladder hanging from the emergency inspection port. The whole evolution took a few minutes, but between the fumes, the lack of oxygen, and the lack of a safety rope, it seemed to Joe that it had been a journey for the ages. Having accomplished this feat, Joe was accepted as an equal in the Black Gang Brotherhood. The fact that as an officer he was almost never invited made his acceptance even sweeter. Replenishment on the move, or unrep in naval jargon. A few simple words to describe one of the most dangerous and at the same time tiring exercises ever practiced by the U.S. Navy. Imagine 2 or sometimes 3 ships, each weighing tens of thousands of tons, running parallel to each other at a distance of several tens of yards. Now imagine massive fuel lines running between ships. Add to this the lines of canvas bags moving cargo and dry goods from the deck of one vessel to another. This organized chaos is replenishment on the go. Joe Price stood as deck safety officer during resupply underway. Saipan transferred jet fuel to the U.S. Arleigh Burke. Typically, the Burke would perform this function with one of the ships in the AO fleet. However, it seemed that the authorities wanted to see how Saipan handled this task. Since everything was going smoothly, Joe didn't have much to do except stay alert and sense what was going on around him. About an hour later, his subconscious brought home what he had been feeling all morning. Saipan was tense. Her normal vibration was wrong. As she picked up speed to replenish supplies as she went, she seemed to stumble and strain. There was no easy way to explain what Joe felt under the soles of his boots. She just wasn't okay. After a heated discussion at the end of the operation, Price went down to Engine Room 1 before returning to his quarters to take a shower. Looking around, he saw where the duty shift had gathered at the steam turbine control station, traditionally known as the steam chest since ancient times, and approached Petty Officer Smith, who stood with his hands in one of the outer panels. "Hey, Smith," he shouted to get her attention. "You need to look at the counterbalance valve on the back vanes." It stutters when you increase the forward revs and you lose power due to the back pressure. I think the seat is worn out and needs replacing. Okay, sir, I'll take a look at it once I replace that tachometer sensor. With a smile and okay, Price left the sailor and went to the long-awaited Hollywood shower in the officers' quarters. Later that night, Chief Machinist Amanda Smith stood shaking her head. How the hell Mr. St. Price had realized there was a problem with the valve was unclear to her. There were rumors in the unit that Mr. Price had some kind of voodoo when it came to steam plants. It is said that he could walk past a gaping hole in the hull and not notice it, but if there was anything wrong with the boiler or turbine, he would worry about it until the problem was solved. He heard one mech announce that the deck needed to be vacated as the F-18 Sea Hornet plastic bug came in for landing with damage. The pilot was advised to eject, but was determined to save his plane. Joe left his office on Deck 3 and quickly walked up the outside stairs to the flight deck. Joe watched the F-18's final approach. It came in low, smoke trailed behind it, and it seemed as if the left engine was on fire. The fire brigade was assembled and squatted in the pit, ready to be called but hoping they wouldn't be needed. The F-18 missed the first two cables, but caught the third with its tail hook and hit the deck. Suddenly, the fuselage broke, and burning fuel along with aircraft debris scattered everywhere. Joe heard screams as part of the left wing, along with a large amount of burning jet fuel, fell onto the fire crew sitting in the pit. At the same time, Joe saw the cockpit with the pilot inside slide across the steel deck and stop almost directly in front of him. Ignoring the flames, he jumped up and pulled the emergency cable on the fuselage under the visor. Joe woke up disoriented and in pain. It took him a while to realize that he was in the infirmary. His return to consciousness was noticed, and an orderly came to his bed, asking the usual questions and taking notes. The orderly adjusted the morphine drip being administered through Joe's Roman 4, and he fell asleep again. "Mr. Price," said his secretary, Joan Wentworth. "Mr. Price, you have a delivery and need your signature." Joe stood up. At least the trembling didn't stop him from walking. Walking out of his office and into his secretary's office, he paused for a moment to touch a ragged, burnt piece of metal attached to his my wall. It was a habit, but it brought him some peace. His eyes glanced at other, familiar things on the wall. His shellback certificate, his sidearm sword, photographs of Pibron personnel, and the entire Black Gang on Saipan signed by everyone from a junior seaman to Chief Boatswain Fireman Humphreys, and many other artifacts from his past. The photograph from Saipan was his most treasured souvenir, and also the one that brought back the shivers the fastest. It was a get-well card from when he was in the infirmary after the fire. The captain himself brought it and presented it to him, along with the Navy Commendation Certificate and Purple Heart, shortly before he was sent to Bethesda for further surgeries and rehabilitation. Joe shook his head to clear his thoughts and continued walking to his outer office. Joan stood at the outer door with a young man holding one of those metal clipboard boxes that seemed to be standard equipment for all couriers. "J. Price?" the man asked, handing the clipboard to Joe. "Please sign on the fourth line." "What am I signing for?" Joe asked, absent-mindedly, taking the offered device. "I'm not sure," the delivery man said. "All I know is that it took me a hell of a lot of time to deliver this today. It's already taken me a couple of hours." "How so?" Joe asked, signing his name on the said line. "I've been in this office at this plant for years." "Well, the original delivery paperwork said it was to be delivered to J. Price at 352 Eagle Street in Albany, but when I got there, it was a parking lot. I had to call dispatch and spend a lot of time before we found out. That you're here on Eagle Street in Schenectady, believe me, driving through both cities against the flow of lunch traffic was not fun," the delivery man said, taking his box back and walking out into the corridor. A moment later, he reappeared, pushing a cart that held a medium-sized wooden box. The box looked like something out of an Indiana Jones movie, old-fashioned boards and planks, all on nails. "Where should I put it?" the man asked. clearly in a hurry to get back to his scheduled deliveries. "Put this in my office, if you don't mind," Joe said. He followed and pointed to a seat to the side of his desk. "Thank you, and sorry for the inconvenience," Joe said. Opening the drawer took longer than expected. It was extremely well constructed. Finally removing the lid, Joe saw the contents. 3 items wrapped in bubble wrap, neatly placed inside the wooden walls, and the voids were filled with plastic peanuts. Taking out 3 items one by one, Joe found a manila envelope between the second and third items. Assuming the envelope contained a delivery note, Joe looked at it first. The mystery of the box was solved when he saw his wife's name, Jennifer, printed on the outside. Now I remember the address the delivery guy mentioned. This was his wife's old studio address. She was an artist and rented space in the old building for several years after their marriage, using it as a studio and gallery. She was known for her watercolors both locally and nationally. She was often invited to take portraits, especially of children, for high society. In fact, for several years after he retired from the Navy, she continued her practice and traveled several times a year for a week or more to various locations around the country. When their daughter Isabel was younger, Jen would take her with her for company. It was the perfect time for the two to bond, and Joe always enjoyed coming home with his wife after such trips. Slightly embarrassed, he realized that he had already opened his wife's package and would have to answer for it, so he decided to examine the contents more carefully. Unfolding the first image was easy once he found the end of the film. Once the film was removed, he found himself holding a very elegant wooden frame and looking at the back. Turning it over, he saw that in the frame there was a large photograph of a young woman in a wedding dress. She held a flower bouquet to her face while looking at the camera. Her beauty was obvious, and the lighting and composition were perfect. The photo was printed in sepia with a soft filter. It was exciting. Joe's eyes went up to his desk, where a copy of it, only in full color, sat in a smaller frame in a place of honor. This photo of his bride, Jennifer, accompanied him from their wedding. He smiled, remembering that the photograph had been sent by his shipmates in Bethesda a few days after his arrival. She was always in his sight, and was his anchor against the physical and emotional pain he endured during the months of rehabilitation. When he came to his senses, he noticed that on the brass plate at the bottom of the frame was written "Bride." Unfolding the second photo revealed a similar sepia frame, only this time the photo was of his wife holding their baby with his older child standing nearby. She was wearing a light, airy dress. The sunlight streaming through the windows of their living room illuminated her from behind, making the dress transparent, almost ephemeral. The boy, apparently his son Robert, looked at the camera with a joyful smile on his face. He was relaxed, and you could see laughter and even a little mischief in his eyes as he stood next to his mother and youngest child. The child was undoubtedly his daughter Isabel. This photo was taken in the spring after Isabel was born. She was only 5 or 6 months old, and Robert was only 5 years old. This frame also had a brass plaque that read, "Mother." Joe looked at the photo and wondered why he had never seen it. She was wonderful. Judging by the age of the children, he realized that this photo was taken during his last business trip, and that this was clearly not a snapshot, but a formal photo session with a professional photographer. He knew he had never seen this photo before, and he didn't understand why. If Jen had tried so hard, she wouldn't have shared it with him. The third photo was soon unfurled. This sepia was his wife again, but this time she was naked. She stood at the foot of their bed, the bed linen rumpled and disheveled. Obviously, she had just woken up. One hand held onto the bedpost while the other reached out, begging the camera to return to her. Her face, glowing with a smile, one side of the lower lip is clamped between the teeth. The whole scene screamed of a woman who had just gotten laid and was trying to lure her lover back into bed. The sign on this frame read, "Mistress." The frame almost fell out of his exhausted fingers. Joe's PTSD was starting to take over. His hands were shaking so much that he had to put down the last photograph before he dropped it. His head was spinning, and the next thing he knew, he was lying on the floor. Reaching for the envelope, he tore it open. Inside were several sheets of paper, one of which looked like an invoice, another like a title deed, and the last one was just a letter. Picking up the letter first, Joe decided to solve the mystery of the box. With trembling hands, Joe picked up the letter and began to read. My dear Jennifer, it is with great sadness that I informed you of the passing of Carlos last week. As I explained to you over the phone, his treatment was quick, and I was told it was painless. I look forward to seeing you next week at the funeral. I'll understand if Robert doesn't come, but I really want to see our Izzy again. She's growing up so fast. She has your hair and Carlos's eyes. I just wish you lived so far away and couldn't come more often so Izzy could spend more time with her other mom and the rest of our family here in Terrebonne. I'm sending you the photos that Carlos left you in his will. This set has always hung proudly in our home. Carlos and I missed the times when we were all here together. Robert was happier then, before he started to grow up and move away from us. With love, Morgana. Who the hell is Morgana and who is Izzy? Joe thought. He recalled being on a mission to Saipan in the Mediterranean during the Bosnian conflict, when Jen was able to set up a radio relay site to tell him that he would become a father again. Jen was so happy and so excited when she told him the good news. She said it must have been the last night of his vacation before his deployment, just over 2 months ago, when she caught the silver bullet. He was delighted. Jen wrote to him every week and sent him progress photos as her bump grew along with the life they created together. He remembered the panic he felt when he received a radio message from the Navy Family Crisis Center that Jennifer's water had broken and Izzy was born 5 weeks premature. By taking advantage of emergency medical leave for the family, he was able to get 9 days to return to her home. He was so distracted that he simply accepted the carrier battle group commander's story that he had been placed on a fighter in need of repairs in Naples, rather than on a routine COD flight. He was glad that this change saved him almost 4 hours. In fact, it saved him even more because once his pilot was airborne, he climbed to 30,000 feet and accelerated the fighter to over 700 knots. In Naples, he learned that the MATS plane had been delayed so he could board it for a direct flight to Rome Air Force Base, northeast of his home in Saratoga, New York. He was given one of the base's cars immediately upon landing and was on his way to Tri-City Medical Clinic between Troy and Schenectady within an hour of landing. When he got to the hospital, he was surprised to learn that both Jen and Izzy had been discharged earlier that day and were most likely at his home. He felt that a 5-week premature baby should have stayed in the hospital for more than a few days. He begged the nurse to let him use the phone to call his wife. She smiled a kind smile and pointed to the desk phone behind the nurse's desk. Joe quickly called home and was delighted when Jen answered. Darling, it's me. I'm at the hospital, but it seems I didn't find you, he said. I'll be home in 40 minutes. Joe? Hospital, Jen croaked, her voice sounding like she had just woken up and was distracted. Yes, honey, Joe replied. I got a family vacation and came home to be with you and Izzy. Are you home? In Saratoga? Jen asked again. Yes, no, I'm in Trek Gradskaya, Joe exclaimed. I'm leaving the hospital and will be home soon. Love you. Okay, see you soon. Love you too, Jen replied. When Joe returned home, he was greeted by Jen with a warm hug and tears in her eyes. He carried his flight bag into their bedroom and found that Jen had removed the bed linen and was busy changing it to clean ones for his return. Izzy was perfect. Her hair was just a few strands long. Her eyelashes and eyebrows had that translucent blonde of very small children. Her eyes were tightly closed. Joe just looked at her in awe. He had just reached into the crib to pick her up when Jen came up to him and wrapped her arms around his waist. She kissed Joe on the cheek and whispered, "Welcome home, Dad." She rested her head against his shoulder as he gently held his daughter. Joe went into the living room and sat down on the sofa next to his son. Robert was quiet, sitting as far away from his father as possible, but still on the couch. He sat watching his father hold his little sister. He seemed hesitant to approach his father. He had previously clung to Jennifer. Jen smiled when she saw Joe sitting on the couch next to Robert, holding Izzy in his arms. It was a perfect picture. She moved around the house, not sitting in one place for a long time. She finished making the bed and put the used sheets in the washing machine. She collected the towels from the bathroom, replaced them with fresh ones, and sent them to the laundry. After a few hours, she managed to get Robert back into bed, fed and changed Izzy's diaper, and she snuggled up to Joe and led him to their bed. It was a glorious 5 days for Joe. He was with his family, his new daughter was perfect, and she seemed big for a preemie. He was almost glad she chose to be born early. He couldn't imagine how Jen would have given birth to Izzy if she had been full term. Jen was attentive, although tired after giving birth and a little distracted. Robert had grown in the few months while he was away on business. Joe noticed that his son seemed so shy and withdrawn. He chalked it up to all the commotion with the birth, the new baby in the house, and his rush to get home. Finally, his leave was over, and with tears in his eyes, he again said goodbye to his beloved family and returned to duty. Joe walked into his private bathroom and splashed cold water on his face to freshen up. He needed to figure out what the hell was going on in his life. Jen was very sad last week, and when he asked, she said her mother wasn't feeling well. She asked if she could take Izzy with her to visit her mother in Vermont. Joe asked if she wanted him to come with them, but she brushed off the idea, saying that they would probably just help her mother and sit and chat, that Joe will be bored to death. Joe quickly agreed, not just because he thought his mother-in-law always looked down on him, but because the new prototype single-circuit boiler room was due to be tested next week, and he really wanted to be there for the first start. Jen and Izzy left in his wife's SUV on Monday morning and planned to stay until Thursday of the following week. Could it be that the real reason she was sad was because this Carlos guy died, and that she wasn't actually at her mom's, but at a funeral in Canada? Joe needed answers, and fast. He also needed to come up with a plan in case things turned out to be as bad as they began to seem. Joe took the phone on the table and dialed a short number. "Control room," came a thin voice from the receiver. "Thomas," said Joe, "this is Joe from the engineering department." "Hey, buddy, what's up?" Tom answered. Thomas Goodfried loved Joe Price from the moment he met him. It was one of the first night shifts Tom worked on his own after being promoted to supervisor, and everything was going to hell. The turbo generator kit that was supposed to be rushed was still on the test bench. The truck that was supposed to pick it up had been waiting for over an hour, and the phone kept ringing. All the big bosses wanted to know if the kit had been sent and insisted that it be sent. Damn it. He should have shipped the thing instead of testing it. The testers did not run the generator at the final stage, and now that almost all the workers have gone home, nothing good will happen at night. Into this chaos walked Joe Price. Tom had never met this man, didn't even know his name. He saw a man of about 45 in a suit who entered the workshop and approached the test stand. The man stood and talked to the testers for a moment, then he seemed to point to something on the side of the stand. Several technicians looked at what he was pointing at, but shook their heads. Finally, the man took a large pipe wrench from a tool cart, walked up to the stand, and hit a part with force. Suddenly, the sound coming from TG changed. The high-pitched harmonic noise that made Tom's teeth ache ceased, and the chesty roar of the steam turbine at full power took its place. A dozen technicians instantly gathered around the man, and it was obvious that everyone wanted to understand what he had done. This discussion continued for several minutes. Tom was distracted by the waiting driver, so when he looked back at the stand, he was shocked to see a man in a suit, no jacket, with bare hands, tinkering with the generator, helping prepare it for dispatch. Finally, after about 3 hours, Tom stood watching the truck with the engine drive away from the factory. At that moment, he noticed that a man in a suit was standing next to him. His shirt was damaged by heating oil, jet fuel, and several rips. The trousers were also beyond repair. The strange thing was that this man was completely happy. On his face was the biggest smile Tom had seen in a long time. The man extended his hand and said, "Price, Joe Price, how are you?" After a brief handshake, Joe Price disappeared into the depths of the plant. The next evening, when Tom arrived at work, He was greeted by the plant's general manager, who congratulated him on having shipped the generator set, if not on time, then quickly enough to meet the terms of the contract. Tom tried to deflect the praise, but the general manager insisted. Tom finally asked how he even knew about Tom and the problems last night. The general manager said he was fully briefed by the head of engineering this morning about the problems with the generator set and how the technicians and Tom had been working hard all night to get the set ready for shipment. Tom was shocked. He had never met a man in a suit who didn't take all the credit for himself, let alone take credit for it from other people. That day, Thomas Goodfried decided that he liked Joe Price, the head of the engineering department. "Tom," said Joe, "I need a special favor. I need to repack a wooden box. It needs to look like it hasn't been opened. I made a mistake and opened a package meant for my wife, and—" "Don't go on, mate," Tom interrupted. "Been there a few times. Let me look at it, and we'll make sure she doesn't suspect anything. Where is he?" "He's in my office," Joe said. "I'll send one of my guys right away," Tom continued. "What size is he?" "They'll need a cart," Joe admitted. "And thank you, Tom. Thank you very much." As soon as he hung up with Tom, Joe took out his cell phone and dialed #6 on speed dial. His mother-in-law answered the second ring and said, "Good morning, handsome. How is my beloved son-in-law today? Besides the fact that I'm your only son-in-law, it's cold and gloomy out here, and I was hoping to warm myself up by talking to your beautiful daughter." Joe chuckled slightly. Laughing, his mother-in-law said, "Well, just because you're the only one doesn't mean you're my favorite. As for Jennifer, she and Izzy went grocery shopping. Can I ask her to call me when she gets back?" "Sure," Joe said. "Tell her to call me when she can. I hope you get better." With a slight hesitation, Mary Parker said, "Thank you, Joseph. That's kind of you. I'll tell Jen to call you as soon as she gets back." "Okay, great," Joe said as he hung up. For a moment, Joe decided to use the Find Me app on Izzy's phone, one that Jen insisted on installing so they could track her when she was a younger teenager. After a few moments, the app went through several screens before installing and showing a flashing ring indicating that Izzy's phone was in northeast Montreal, Canada, and not her grandmother's town, Bennington, Vermont. Son of a bitch. Joe thought his damn mother-in-law was involved in what was happening. She just lied to Joe about having her daughter and granddaughter in Vermont. Joe's next call was put on hold as he rummaged through his desk for several minutes until he finally pulled out an old, worn-out personal phone book. Quickly flipping through the pages, he found the number he was looking for. Having dialed it on the phone, he sat down in a chair and waited for someone to answer on the other end of the line. "Good morning," said an older female voice. "Good morning, madam," said Joe. "This is Joe Price. Is he there?" "Don't pretend you're Joe Price, young man." Mary Bedford giggled into the phone. "It's been ages. How are things with Jen and the kids?" "They're fine, Madam Bedford," Joe said, hoping she wouldn't question further. "So, now I'm Madam Bedford." At least it's better than Madam," she replied. "I'll call him now." Apparently, she put the phone down on the table and walked away. On the phone, he heard a woman's voice shouting, "Bill, come here. Young Joseph wants to talk to you." He heard noises and doors slamming and muffled conversations that sounded like, "Joe, why would you call him?" He heard noises, and then a voice said, "Joe, it's been centuries. How can I help you?" Joe explained what had been happening to him since the box was delivered. The discovery of the letter and subsequent confirmation of the lie when he called his mother-in-law. He explained that he was still trying to wrap his head around Jen's betrayal, but knew that he needed a lot more information before he decided to take any action or take revenge. "Got it, Joe. Let me make some calls." "Will you be on this number all day?" said the voice. "Yes, sir," Joe said. "I plan to be on this number, but if I have to leave, I will forward the calls to my cell phone." "Okay, great. Don't do anything stupid. You've done this more than once, and I won't be able to get you any medals this time," said us Navy Capt. William Bedford, former commander of the Saipan, as he hung up. He walked out of the kitchen and into his office, waving to his curious wife as he began searching for an old phone book. Opening it to the desired page, he quickly dialed the number. "Gus, this is Bill. Listen, I got a bad call from young Joe Price. I think you need to talk to him directly." Joe was angry and paced around the office. He needed something to do, but he promised his old ship's commander that he would wait by the phone. The unexpected call almost triggered his PTSD again before he realized what was happening. He saw that it was an outside call, so he picked up the phone and said, "Turbine Division, Engineering Division, this is Joe Price speaking." A middle-aged female voice said, "Commander Joseph Price." "Yes, that's him," said Joe. "Stay on the line. Admiral Cohen wants to speak with you," the voice said. Joe was shocked, firstly, that the commander of the 6th Landing Force had become a vice admiral, and secondly, that the admiral was calling him. A moment later, the line clicked and a gruff voice said, "Joseph, Bill said I needed to talk to you." "What's going on, son?" Bill said it was important. Once again, Joe told his story about the find. It didn't get any easier each time. "Meg," Vice Admiral Cohen shouted to his secretary, Senior Chief Officer Megan Scott, "contact Bill Bedford immediately." A few minutes later, his phone rang. "Captain Bedford on line 2, Admiral," came the voice from the receiver. Picking up the phone, Cohen said, "Bill, this is Gus. Look, I think Joe really has a problem. Thanks for calling me. I need you to get in touch with Jack Collier, Freddie Barnes, and Mike Briscoe first. If we tell Joe right away, he'll throw a fit and tell us to leave, so we won't tell him anything until we figure it out. I want to know everything about Carlos Señor and what it means for Jenny Price. Also, we'll probably need a lawyer." "I see, sir. I'll have to check on Bart. Last I heard, he was a partner in some prestigious firm, making a ton of money and hating it," Bedford replied. "What is our time slot?" "I'm not sure, Bill," said the Admiral. "I think the real question is Joseph. He didn't sound well, and I'd like to calm him down as soon as possible." "Okay, I'll get on with it," Bill said. "Anything else you can think of at the moment?" "Yes," said Cohen. "Where is Lieutenant Commander Davis?" "Oh God, sir," Bedford sighed. "Do you think it's that bad?" "I don't know, Bill. I want everything under control. Do you know where they put it? I believe he is in long-term care at the Veterans Hospital in Batawa, New York, sir." "Would you like me to confirm his current condition?" Bedford replied. "Please, even if we don't need a commander, we owe him. The system has outlived him and spat him out. At a minimum, let him know that his shipmates remember him," said Vice Admiral Cohen. "It will be done, sir, and thank you," Bill said. As Bill drove up the gravel road to the main building, his gaze took in the beautiful lawns and manicured plantings and trees scattered throughout the grounds. He parked in the small lot on the side of the building and walked towards the grand front door. Approaching the front desk, he said, "Good morning. Captain Bedford, I would like to see Lieutenant Commander Jonathan Davis." "Yes, sir," she said, typing on the keyboard in front of her. He was supposed to be at Taekwondo class this morning, but he said he wasn't feeling well and stayed in his room. It's room 305 in the annex. Do you need directions, sir?" "Yes, thank you," Bedford said. After finding room 305, he had to stop people twice to ask for directions. Bill Bedford knocked on the door. "Come in," came a voice from inside. Pushing open the door, Bill entered the room and saw a man of about 40, fully clothed, sitting upright on the only bed in the room. The man stood up and extended his hand in greeting. "Sir, good to see you." Bill shook his hand with his right hand and grabbed his forearm with his left. "John, I'm glad to see you too. How are you doing?" "It's fine, sir. After the last incident, I promised to behave and stay here. It's calm and peaceful here, to be honest. I was waiting for you." "What do you mean, John? I didn't tell anyone that I was coming here to this wilderness to see you." John extended his left hand and pointed to a small carry-on bag next to the roller bag, both packed and clearly ready to go. "Sir, you offend me. The children were injured, perhaps many years ago, but they are still children. I am collected, and as I said, I am waiting for you." Not for the first time since he had met John Davis, a chill ran down Bedford's spine. "Stop doing that, John," he said. John simply blinked slowly a few times and his eyes started to look strange, and then said, "Sorry, sir. I sometimes forget that it scares people. If you're ready, can we go?" They gathered for a meeting at the Courtyard Hotel in Schenectady, in the Mohawk Harbor area. The group, assembled under Vice Admiral Cohen's orders, gathered and greeted each other like old friends over coffee and sweets. Captain Bedford entered and began the meeting. "Gentlemen, you all know why we are here. Joe needs to know what is going on behind his back, and we need to come up with a plan that suits his needs for the future. Joe, do you want to say a few words?" "First of all, I want to tell each of you that the fact that you put aside your business and came here today for my problem means a lot to me," Joe said, looking intently at Bedford. "I really don't want to bother people with what is essentially my problem." There were noises and sighs, and the group clearly dismissed Joe's concern, putting it in its place as if they believed that such support was normal, and why would Joe think otherwise? Joe talked about what he knew, what he suspected, and what he knew and didn't know. After this story, which took about an hour with interruptions to clarify points, Bedford resumed his speech. "Fine. Here's how I propose to proceed. Jack, you will be number 4. Freddie will handle numbers 23, and Mike will be number 5. Barty is coming to us from town on legal matters." "Who will do the reconnaissance?" asked Jack Collier. "We will need deep reconnaissance, and it looks like this nastiness has been building up for over 20 years. "It's already decided, Jack," said Bedford. "Admiral Cohen is sending some of his people from one of the black programs to obtain the necessary information. This also gives us the opportunity to cut off the Admiral and Joe if necessary." Smiling, Bedford continued, "Gentlemen, we're like a bunch of adventurers here for this job." His comment was met with various chuckles and shouts from the group. "One last thing, guys," Bedford said. "Commander Davis has agreed to join us, and will work independently, but in coordination with the team." The room became so quiet you could have heard a pin drop. "Davis, Jonathan Davis," Fred whispered. "I didn't expect to be part of his madness, and I certainly don't want to end up in Rwanda again." "So, Commander," Bedford chided, "Commander Davis may have his problems, but he is still one of the best developers of custom special weapons solutions we've ever produced." "Okay, if you say so, sir," said Fred Barnes. "Just don't plan on using his jewels." "Oh, of course not, Commander, nothing like that," answered Bedford with a slight smile on his lips. Joe heard his cell phone ring while he was in the shower and again while he was shaving. Entering the bedroom, he picked up the phone and saw that he had missed 3 calls. All are marked unknown. Shrugging, he threw the phone back on the bed and began to get dressed. As he buttoned his shirt, his cell phone rang again. "Joe Price," he said. "Joseph, how are you?" came a voice that he had not heard for almost a decade. "Jonathan? Jonathan Davis?" he asked, almost in a whisper. "Yes, Joseph, it's me," said a calm voice from the receiver. "Do you have a minute to talk to an old friend?" "John, you were on trial in the Rwanda case. What's going on?" asked Joe. "Joe," said the voice, "that was then, and this is now. Please, I really need to talk to you. Personally." "Fine, fine. How about 10 a.m.? I can meet you outside the office if you want, or you can come here, whichever is more convenient for you," Joe said. "It's better not in the office. Do you know the diner on Route 28? asked the voice. "Yes," said Joe. "Okay, I'll meet you there at 10:30 if that suits you," Davis replied. Yes. Okay, it's 10:30 then," Joe said. "John, are you okay? Do you need anything?" The voice went silent for a few minutes, and Joe was afraid the connection had broken when the voice spoke again. "I'm fine now. Thanks for the offer. I've always considered you a friend, Joseph. Your words mean a lot. Thank you." They sat in a booth at the back of the diner. Davis had already started drinking coffee before Joe arrived. Joseph, I need to ask you a question, Davis almost whispered. These people are hurting your children. It almost broke your son, and Izzy seems to be more out of touch with reality every day. So I need to ask you a question. What do you want? Joe was shocked. How do you know this? How do you know about Robert and Izzy? He looked closely at his friend. Davis returned the look. His eyes blinked slowly, and when they opened, his pupils became almost vertical. He blinked again, and they looked normal. Joe shuddered and covered his eyes with his hands. "Stop that," he almost shouted. "Damn, this is scary." Davis continued to look at Joe. He tilted his head a little to the right, like a wolf deciding when to attack and where to strike first, and said, "Your children have suffered. Do you want justice or revenge?" "Crap," said Joe. "Justice or revenge?" "Exactly," replied Davis. "Justice is what Captain Bedford and the boys are planning for you. And I suggest you take revenge. At the end of the day, it's your choice." "Jonathan," Joe said anxiously, "what have you done again? What are you planning? Not Rwanda again, for God's sake." "Joseph, calm down. I'm just an old friend asking you a rhetorical question," Davis said. "John," said Joe, "there's nothing rhetorical about you. I need to know what you've done." "Did I do it? Did I do it? My friend, I haven't done anything yet. That's why I need to know your thoughts," Davis said. Reaching across the table, he grabbed Joe's hand. Rather, he hooked her. "Think carefully, but I need your answer soon." Standing up, Davis quickly left the diner. Joe was left with his memories and a piece of paper with 10 numbers on it. It was now the end of September, almost October. The Combat Command, as they called themselves and actually were, was meeting at the Marriott again, this time with Admiral Cohen's intelligence officers. Bedford began the meeting. "Okay, let's start. We have with us today Mr. X, Mr. Y, and Miss Z. I ask that in this meeting you all use these names, even if you personally know one or more of them. These people. Now I will give the floor to Mr. Y." As the man identified as Y came forward, Mr. Cuddy X pulled out a medium-sized electronic device from under his chair and placed it on the table. By pressing the button, it began to make a sound similar to the sound of water in the shower. It creates white noise to drown out audio recordings, as well as a jamming signal in the 850-19 MHz frequencies for electronic devices, X said in response to the group's unspoken questions. Mr. Y began the briefing. He revealed that a few years before her assignment in the Mediterranean, when Jen was starting her practice of traveling for portraits, she met and was seduced by Carlos Signoret. Carlos introduced her to all the old-moneyed families who could afford and appreciate her work. He also introduced her to his wife Morgana and his friends and relatives in Canada. Jen's position as Carlos' mistress was accepted by the old-fashioned culture of this elite high society. The worst part was that while preparing for a business trip to the Mediterranean, Carlos impregnated Jen. Isabel was not premature. Jen lied about the date of conception. Ruining the remnants of love, if there were any, information emerged that during a business trip, Jen had moved Carlos into their home as a replacement husband and father. In fact, the night he returned home on vacation, he might have found 2 scammers in his bed if Jen hadn't called from the hospital. Carlos barely made it out into the night, and Jen only had time to change the sheets before Joe entered the house. The cruelest blow was that after he left, Carlos moved back into his house. This elite piece of shit raised his son for almost 2 years while Joe was in the Navy. Z revealed that she was a photo analyst working on photographs. She studied the details of the photographs themselves to establish the chronology and location of the shooting. She had a few questions that only Joe could answer, but in the end she had an accurate and provable timeline for the photos. Joe was beside himself with rage. He wanted to destroy and kill everything in his path. The betrayal and disrespect were almost unbearable. What made him want to either rip everything out of himself or commit murder was discovered and revealed. More than once he thought about contacting Davis and demanding revenge, but his friends understood him and helped him calm down when the information was especially painful. A week after the group's last meeting, Joe was stopping by his house after work when Jen approached him as he was hanging up his coat. Jen explained that she was contacted by a certain Morgana Signoret, the widow of the world-famous photographer Carlos Signoret, and asked her to help organize an exhibition at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. Morgana's husband recently passed away, and his portfolio was shown in its entirety for the first time. Joe put on his best mannequin, yes, pretty face, and asked a few pointless questions, enough to show that he was listening to her, but not enough to show that he already knew who the hell Carlos was, sir. It was almost November, and Jen was spending more and more time working on a photography exhibit at the Met. It was necessary to go through customs clearance and obtain insurance. The logistics were huge. As the time for the exhibition approached, Morgana Signor began to visit him more and more often. Joe noticed that the two women were repeatedly crying and clinging to each other, quickly breaking apart if they thought Joe would show up. Izzy began to withdraw more into herself, spending entire days in her room, avoiding both her mother and Morgana as much as possible. One Saturday afternoon, seeing his daughter hiding in her room again, Joe rummaged through his wallet for the piece of paper Davis had given him. After dialing his cell phone number, he pressed send and waited for the connection. "Yes, Joseph," said the voice that answered the phone. "I chose justice, my friend. Justice is all I need. The consequences of anything else could destroy Izzy. She's barely staying afloat as it is," Joe said. "As you say," the voice replied, and then the connection was interrupted. "Jen," Joe said, "do you have a minute to talk about your Christmas plans?" "Of course, honey," Jen said, wiping her hands on the apron at her waist. "It's not even Thanksgiving, but it's never too early to start planning for the holidays. I thought that since the Met Show is in the second week of January, it would be wise for Mrs. Signor and your friends from Canada to come here before the Christmas rush. A quick train ride gets everyone here from Montreal and then back to New York. We have more than enough rooms for people to stay," Joe said. Jen was delighted. Gathering her entire family under one roof for the holidays was more than she could have hoped for. She wrapped her arms around Joe's neck and kissed him with the most passionate kiss she had felt in years. "Thank you, thank you, thank you," she said. "Robert Price is tired. He worked 60 and 70 hours a week while trying to start his career. He became increasingly frustrated with the way his life was turning out and desperately wished his father was someone he could turn to. He could never understand how his father allowed things to run their course, and he ended up having to leave home as soon as he could. Going to college was his salvation, and he never looked back. The thought of talking to his mother made his stomach ache, so he did what he had done most of his life, suppressed his emotions and tried to immerse himself in his work. It didn't help that his mother called a few months ago to say that Uncle Carlos had died. She and his sister were going to Canada for a funeral and wanted him to go with them. Trying not to scream, and also trying not to vomit, Robert told his mother in no uncertain terms that he could no longer and would not participate in her and his father's lifestyle and did not want to go to any funeral. His mother scolded him for almost an hour before he could end the call and hang up. With this mindset, he was just returning to his living room after getting a beer from the refrigerator when he heard someone ring his doorbell. Opening the door and finding my father standing, there was the last straw. "What do you want?" he mocked his father. "How long have you known?" asked the father in a dead, even voice. "It is known that," asked Robert. "Did you know that your mother cheated on me?" Joe replied. "What? Now, more than 20 years later, you're asking me this? What the heck? You let Mom have sex with Carlos. For God's sake, take his damn child. You leave me alone with no one to talk to for all this time, and now you ask me how long I've known. I've known this since I was 6, you piece of shit. You make me sick," Robert shouted just before everything went dark. Robert began to wake up. He was lying on his back. Through the toes of his boots, he could see the open front door. Half of his head hurt terribly, and his vision on that side was poor. Groaning, he tried to stand up, but decided it would be easier to just roll over and get on all fours. He looked up and saw his father sitting on the couch drinking beer. "You have one chance, and one chance only, you little idiot, to explain what you just said," his father whispered. "If I don't like it, you won't have to worry about me bothering you anymore. You say you're a man and can handle a man's job. Well, let's just say you've got a whole bunch of stinking man crap dumped on your plate, and it's time to share the truth." It took Robert several hours to tell his story. He couldn't look his father in the face and continued to break down. Robert told his father that Carlos had been living in their house during his father's absence. How he took his father's place, they went somewhere and did something as a family, how they came to Canada for Thanksgiving and Christmas, how he played with all these children introduced as his cousins, and how his aunts and uncles tried to make him feel at home. He told how Carlos went home to Canada after Joe returned from Bethesda, but his mom and Izzy went there as often as they could, leaving him at home with his dad. Finally, as the story was told, the pain and suffering that had gripped his heart for 2 decades went away. Joe stood up from the sofa where he had been sitting during the story and hugged his son, who was tormented almost all his life by evil and illnesses imposed on him by his mother. Robert clung to his father. In a little boy's whisper, he said, "I'm sorry, Daddy, I'm so sorry. Mom told us over and over, that we shouldn't say anything about Carlos or Canada or anything else. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore, so I left for college and never came back." SHHH. Now everything is all right. It's okay. Joe survived Thanksgiving by just sticking to the plan. Robert was planning to come here for the first time in years and was looking forward to spending time with his son without the elephant in the room. Christmas was almost here when Morgana and the others began filtering into his house. He stopped thinking of it as his home. It took some work organizing the logistics, but everything came together. Jen was oblivious to everything going on around her as she prepared both for the Met exhibition, for Morgana and her lover's family to be in her art, and for Morgana and her family to come to Christmas for the first time since then. Since Joe returned from combat, Izzy was more withdrawn than usual, but still helped Jen a little after returning from school. Robert also agreed to return home for Christmas, for the first time since he left for college. Joe continued to go to work and maintain a normal schedule. Joe looked up as the internal phone rang once. "Engineering, Price is listening," he said. "Joseph, I have information you need to hear. This needs to be discussed in person, and you should be alone." "Don't tell others about this call," said a familiar voice. Joe looked at the phone. "John, how do you call from an internal number?" A short laugh was heard in response. "Ask no questions, and I will not tell you a lie, Joseph." "Joseph, what I have to tell you is very, very bad. In fact, when I came across this, I was tempted to ignore your request and punish them myself. Signorette's collection contains a significant number of photographs of your daughter Isabel. There are typical photos of growing up, birthdays and holidays," John relayed. "Okay," Joe said, "that sounds fine, especially if these people thought Izzy was Carlos's daughter and Jen was his honorary mistress. Joe, there are pictures in the collection that seem to start when Izzy was about 6 or 7 years old. They continue to this day. Christmas and New Year were difficult and stressful times for Joe Price. He was drinking. He met with old friends. He went to the office for no reason. But what helped him get through it all was time spent with his son. God, how wonderful it was. They found things from Robert's childhood that they thought were lost. Jen, Morgana, and the others had tea parties and parties. They discussed politics and world events. Essentially, they ridiculed and demeaned everything Joe held dear and his moral compass. They disparaged the military and had no remorse criticizing Joe's time in the Navy. He was truly shocked to learn that his own wife had repeated these slander. After the first few objections and arguments, Joe realized that he was putting his plans in jeopardy if he angered Jen and her company by pointing out their worldview. If they leave his house, everything will be in vain. He spent more time with a drink in hand and in his home office, listening to Johnny Cash on headphones, especially his favorite song by the artist, Hurt. He met with Bedford's group and remained calm. He was playing the long game and wanted not just victory, but terrible revenge against these world dominionists who had destroyed his marriage and his life. It was early January in New York. Slush snow was piled here and there, and a cold, biting wind blew along the edges of the tall buildings. It was the main studio and headquarters of one of the major broadcast networks. A discreet white van pulled up to the curb near the studio's loading dock. The two men got out and walked to the supply door, ringing the bell. Four men emerged from the back of the van and pulled three large portfolios from the cargo area. One person carried each portfolio, while a fourth seemed to stand guard. Theodore Ted Abercrombie operated the console for Good Morning New York. It should have been great. The producer managed to negotiate the showing of a previously unknown collection of photographs by Carlos Signoret. There was a lot of bustle on stage as they prepared for today's show. The guards, who were clearly security guards watching the photographs, dispersed as soon as the scene was set. The two men asked permission to watch the show from the production booth. After assurances that they would stay away, they were allowed into the control center to observe everything that went on behind the scenes of the national broadcast. Chief Petty Officer First Class Anthony Lucia leaned over and whispered in Ted's ear, "This is the Panther panel you're working on, and I can operate it just as well as you can. If the broadcast signal I see on my smartphone deviates from the scene, Sergeant Gomez will immediately limit you to extreme bias, and I will take over control of the broadcast. Is it clear now?" Ted turned his head to look at one of the security guards who entered the studio with exhibition photographs. The man held his sport coat open to reveal a black and brown handgun in a shoulder holster. Swallowing, Ted returned his attention to his console and hoped that no one in higher office would give the command to abort during the next segment. Good morning, friends. I'm Kevin Kraft, and this is Good Morning New York. As I promised before the break, we are now going to have a special treat. As you may or may not know, the Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art is preparing an exclusive exhibition of the catalog of the amazing photographer Carlos Signoret. I am pleased to announce that Good Morning New York has been selected as the exclusive channel for the first public screening of Signoret's previously unknown series of photographs. Here to explain everything is the series' proud owner, Mr. Joseph Price. "Hi, Kevin," Joe said, shaking the host's hand. "I'm just the owner of these works. Mr. Kai Cohen will be here doing the actual performance." Kevin quickly recovered and turned his trademark megawatt smile towards the old man Price pointed at. "Mr. Cohen." "Kevin, let me first introduce Mr. Gregory Rukmansky. Gregory is an art expert specializing in photography. He was hired to authenticate these photographs." Mr. Rukmansky. "Thank you, Mr. Cohen. As you said, I was hired to conduct authentication and evaluation of photographs allegedly created by Mr. Carlos Signoret. I have examined all three photographs and can conclude that they are all original works by Signoret, signed and dated by the photographer himself. I consulted with two other experts, and we estimate the estimated value of each photograph to be $800,000 or $32 million since I have all three certified appraisals in this series. The notoriety associated with this after this morning, I am sure, will lead to an even greater increase in price if the owner wants to place the collection on the market." Mr. Rukmansky then handed the envelope to Mr. Price. Mr. Cohen thanked Mr. Rukmansky and turned to the next gentleman in line. "The next gentleman is Mr. Frederick Bartholomew-esque. Mr. Bartholomew is an associate of the law firm of Doyle and Sons here in Manhattan." Mr. Bartholomew. "Thank you, Mr. Cohen. I was invited to investigate the legal ownership status of these three photographs. After verifying the ownership signed by the photographer Carlos Signoret himself, and after consulting with the law firm of Grissom and Grissom of Montreal, Canada, the executors of Mr. Signoret's estate, I can say without hesitation that Miss Jennifer Price is the legal heir to these photographs, and by virtue of her marriage to Mr. Joseph Price, Mr. Price is an equal owner of the joint property." Kevin looked a little confused by all this nonsense, but was still working the camera. "So, Mr. Cohen," he asked. "Yes, Kevin. Sorry for the rambling, but I wanted to finish all the prep work early. So, without further ado, everyone will turn their attention to the three easels. This first photo is called Bride. This is a sepia photo of Jennifer Price taken on her wedding day to then LT Joseph Price Usson. There were oohs and ahs from the audience as a close-up photo appeared on the overhead monitors. The second photo also shows Jennifer Price with her two children, son Robert Price and daughter Isabel. Her name is Mother. It is in Mr. and Mrs. Price's bedroom and was made when Isabel was a child. Approximately 5 months being the time during which Mr. Price served his country. Once again, the audience responded adequately to the emotions evoked by the touching scene. The third and last photograph is called Lover. Here the image on the screen was pixelated and out of focus so as not to violate the rules of morning censorship. Here we again see Mrs. Joseph Price, Jennifer, as a woman seducing her. The beloved Mr. Carlos Sr. returns to his boudoir. Using photographic analysis techniques typically reserved for military intelligence purposes, we determined that this photograph was again placed in Mr. and Mrs. Price's bedroom, and that it was taken several days after the previous photograph. By the way, Kevin, Mr. B. Sr. is also Isabel Price's biological father. Further, the affair between Mr. Sr. and Mrs. Price began when then LT. Price served in the Navy, and in fact Isabel was conceived while he was preparing to go into battle in Bosnia, Mrs. Price passing the child off as Mr. Bishop Price's child, with full knowledge of herself and Mr. Senora that Mr. Sr. was a true father. All hell was going on in the studio. The venue manager was trying to get the cameras to monitor what was happening on the set. It was better than Springer. People in the tower tried to contact the program manager, but he did not answer calls. They sent a footman on stage to physically call the program manager, but the courier also disappeared. The only ones who seemed calm were Mr. Price and his entourage. Cohen continued, "Kevin, I'd like to introduce you to Mr. D.G. Jenkins, also from the law firm of Doyle and Sons." Kevin by this time had absolutely no idea what was going on, so he numbly shook the offered hand and stood there like a zombie as Mr. Jenkins walked onto the center stage. Mr. D. Jenkins began to speak. "It is my sad duty to inform your audience that divorce papers are currently being served on Miss Jennifer Price, as well as arrest warrants for Miss Price, Morgana Senor, and others for violating the Mann Act and 18 2251 sexual exploitation, 18 2252, certain activities involving sexually exploitative material, and 18 2260, production of sexually explicit material." Jennifer and Morgana sat and watched in horror as the events unfolded on television. Jennifer was crying. Instead of a happy article about the Met show, her husband had just destroyed her world. Why was her husband on TV with pictures of her? Why was this man saying bad things about Carlos? Morgana hugged Jennifer, trying to give her all the support she could. She didn't understand why Joseph would do something as hurtful as exposing the love affair between Jennifer, her, and Carlos as if it were something dirty. Suddenly, there was knocking on the front and back doors, people shouting, "Police! ICE! Open the door!" Jennifer and Morgan's guests stumbled down the stairs, wrapped in robes and bed linens, wondering what was going on. Izzy ran to her mother, who scooped her into her arms, just as the front door swung open and fell to the floor. Suddenly, men in black burst through the destroyed door, waving weapons and shields. The back door swung open and several more men dressed in black rushed inside. People were screaming and crying, and men were pushing people to the floor, shouting, "Down, down, lie down on the floor." Within minutes, her entire family and friends were handcuffed and herded outside, where they were herded into waiting vans. A man in a dark suit approached Jennifer and asked if she was Jennifer Price. When she said yes, he handed her a large manila envelope and said, "Mrs. Jared Price, you've been served," and then walked away. Jennifer was terrified. Her whole world collapsed. She was in prison and didn't know why. She clutched the envelope that the man put in her hands, not understanding what it meant and why everything was happening. Mrs. Price, my name is Francis Kelly. I am the Assistant United States Attorney for Eastern New York. I need to ask you a few questions. Do you mind if I record our conversation? Jennifer nodded her head yes. Mrs. Roars Price, I need you to answer me verbally. Can I record our conversation? Yes, she cleared her throat. Yes, everything is fine. Fine. Now, Mrs. Price, I will read you your Miranda rights. Do you understand what I told you, and do you want a lawyer present before I ask questions? No, I do not understand. Why is this happening? Why am I here? Jennifer answered. Mrs. Price, please. I know this is all very traumatic, but I really need to ask you these few questions, he said, pointing to the mirror behind him to get the suspect a glass of water. Mrs. Price, have each of you taken your children to the home of Carlos and Morgana Senior in Terrebonne, Canada? Yes, sure. Carlos and Morgana are my friends, Jen said. Have you ever had a reason to celebrate holidays and family events while you were with the ladies? What does that have to do with anything? Did you introduce to your children, Robert and Isabel, that Morgana and Carlos Senior, along with their extended family, were their family? That your relationship with Carlos Senior was the same as that which you had with Mr. Joseph Price, your then husband? I don't know. Not many words. We were family. We went there for Christmas and birthdays. Robert was playing with other children. They were his cousins, and all the adults were his aunts and uncles. Mrs. Price, during all the times you visited Senor, did you explain to your children that Carlos was Isabella's father? Have you ever had sexual relations with Morgana and Carlos Senior, or both of them? Maybe, I don't know. I think the point is that Carlos was more than just Uncle Carlos. When Izzy was with Carlos, it was clear that they were father and daughter. We have never hidden this. Of course, we had a relationship while I was visiting. Carlos and his family were very accepting of my status as his mistress. They considered Izzy part of their family, and I always found time to make love. We were very much in love, and that's what people in love do. Why are you asking me these questions? Why am I here? Mrs. Price, the reason for these questions is that you simply read in the record that you repeatedly transported your then minor children across an international border for the purpose of engaging in adultery. You further included these minor children in deceiving and concealing this matter from your husband Joseph Price, which you presented to them as normal to the lifestyle you were leading, which caused these minor children immeasurable emotional harm and exposed them to potential physical harm. Physical harm? What are you talking about? They were never harmed. Mrs. Price. You took them to a foreign country under cover of secrecy, without passports or any identification documents. You have placed yourself and them in the hands of people who you admit actively participated in hiding your adultery from your husband. What do you think would happen to them if you were injured or killed while outside the United States? Would these same people contact your husband and return your children? Would they just raise the kids without getting involved with your husband? Thought it more appropriate to simply make the children disappear without anyone knowing where they were, so the latter would be very easy to do. Jennifer was stunned by what Kelly was saying. Carlos and Morgana would never hurt Robert and Izzy. She was Carlos' mistress, an accepted part of his family. She and Morgana were lovers both with and without Carlos. She knew that Carlos and Morgana considered themselves parents to Izzy and Robert, even if Robert was not blood related to Carlos like she and Joseph were. It was crazy. Stop, stop. I don't want to hear anything else. I need a lawyer. I need to talk to a lawyer. Okay, Mrs. Price, you will be allowed to contact a lawyer of your choice, or one will be assigned to you. He looked up at the ceiling and said, recording ended this day at 2:24 p.m. Mrs. Price, I'm John Graymore of Craigmore and Associates. I have been appointed your lawyer. Rest assured that I will provide you with the best protection. It seems someone wanted to make sure you couldn't find a decent public defender, agreed to pay my firm's bills, and pulled some strings to get my bosses to assign me to work for you. Now, can you tell me your story? Mr. Graymore, Mrs. Price, please sit down. He looked up at the ceiling and said, Interrogation of Mrs. Jennifer Price, continued today, 0930. Mr. Prezor Graymore, your client has been charged with multiple crimes. She is charged under the Mann Act with interstate and foreign transportation of any woman or girl for the purpose of sex trade or for any other immoral purpose. I believe that the lifestyle that she and the Signors led and the obvious emotional trauma of Isabel and Robert meet the requirements of this law. It is only because we do not have evidence of any actual sexual assault that we do not pursue more serious criminal charges. The rest of Signora's family was eventually dealt with most of the extended family sent back to Canada with notice that they should not attempt to re-enter the United States for several years. Morgana was also charged under the Mann Act and child pornography laws. She was tried right after Jennifer. Jennifer's criminal trial took place in Albany Federal District Court. Francis Kelly worked diligently and methodically to substantiate the charges against Jennifer. Everything was quite simple as the photographs, legal documents transferring ownership of the photographs, and the customs and immigration station logs that Jennifer used to leave and enter the country were flawless. A parade of witnesses and experts passed through the hall. The trial lasted several weeks. Jennifer tried to explain that she loved both Joseph and Carlos and that nothing bad or immoral had happened. Her defense team tried to present the normality of the position of emeritus mistress in European culture. This did not sit well with the jurors as they could be seen shifting uncomfortably in their chairs as the testimony continued. Robert and Izzy had to testify regarding the circumstances of the Signor's numerous visits to their mother's home in Terrebonne, as well as the Signor's visits to their home outside Saratoga. They explained that Carlos actually lived in this house as a father to them and a husband to their mother when Joseph was sent to sea. Robert spoke about his estrangement from his real father, Joe, and the disgust he had towards him until recently. Izzy supported her mother's version that everything in the Jennifer-Carlos-Morgana triad was correct and normal. She explained how, as she grew up, her mother told her the truth that Carlos was her biological father and that this information should be kept from Joe. Joe sat through the trial stoically wondering what happened to the woman he married. Was it something he did or didn't do, or was it something inherent to Jennifer? He knew he didn't fit into Jennifer's artsy-fartsy persona and didn't understand it, but he didn't realize how far they were from what he considered normal. William and Mary Bedford sat with Joe for most of the trial, but eventually forced him to return to their home in Pennsylvania until the trial was completed. They supported him on his bad days and celebrated with him on his good days. They provided Joe with a place to meet his ex-son and gave them both a place to begin healing. The hearing for separation and custody of children after a criminal trial was disappointing. The situation became tense and anger flared. Part of the debate was who would support Izzy if Jennifer served time in federal prison. Jennifer took the position that without the income from her portrait and gallery commissions, Joe would not be able to keep up the house payments, and since Joe needed to work, there would be no one to look after Izzy. Jennifer and Morgana wanted Morgana's sister to move into the Price house and live as Izzy's foster mother, while Joe paid child support and lived elsewhere. Joe wanted full custody of Izzy and ownership of his home. It was another long day in the ongoing struggle. If Signor's extended family had not been so angry at their rough treatment and had not financed Jennifer's legal bills, it would have ended quickly. Thanks to their financial support, Jennifer was able to endure the long struggle. Your Honor, if the court pleads, a voice came from the gallery, I would like to file a lawsuit. Mr. Bartholomew stood and, at a sign from the judge, walked down the center aisle and approached the bench. Will both lawyers come to the dock, said the judge, motioning for the clerk of the court to take over the big case that Mr. Bartholomew was carrying. Sir, please explain yourself to the court and lawyers. Thank you, Your Honor. I have documents and testimony that prove the following facts. First, that Isabel Price is the biological daughter of Carlos Signor and Jennifer Price, and second, that Mr. Senor and Mrs. Tourist Price openly lived together and presented themselves as a couple in the state of New York and in the country of Canada, thus having entered into a common law marriage and 3 marriages which Joseph Price never knew about, and at no time did Mr. Price consent to Jennifer Price's adultery. However, I am satisfied, and it is the basis for the amicus that through the common law marriage between Jennifer Price and Carlos Senor, a bond is established whereby Mr. Price is Isabel Price's legal guardian and gives Mr. Price the right to do so. Half of Carlos Senor's estate through his legal marriage to Jennifer Price. This eliminates any question that Mr. Price is required to pay child support. In addition, Mr. Joseph Price's share of the estate of Carlos Senora will support Mr. Price and Isabel Price in their family home, and allow Mr. P. Price to hire a housekeeper acceptable to Child Protective Services. After all, it will only be 20 months before Isabel comes of age. More than a little excitement followed his statement. The separation papers were finally accepted and Joe received full custody of Isabel. He fully supported her fight to return to normal life. Vadim Cohen arranged for Izzy to attend a very special and exclusive program originally created for victims of sex trafficking and then arranged private therapy for many years later. Joe knew about the event, but was never told the true cost of the programs or what arrangements needed to be made for Izzy to attend. He knew his old boss had pulled some strings to help Izzy, but he had never realized the extent and reach of the network that supported him. Adding the value of the photos to their joint holdings completely unbalanced everything. Joe gave Jennifer the photographs and kept all other public property, including the house, furniture, and cars. Since she was in prison at the time, Joe placed all of her personal belongings, along with photographs, in secure storage. Joe received several $100,000 from the senor's estate, mostly just to get rid of him. After the mandatory 1-year separation, Joe filed for divorce. Jennifer tried to stop the divorce, but found it difficult to fight while in a prison cell. It seemed like every time she hired a lawyer to fight for her, after a few weeks the lawyer would suddenly remember that they had something else really important to do. Finally, after months of trying to delay the inevitable, she signed the papers. She served 8 years of her 15-year sentence before being paroled. Getting out of jail wasn't that much of an improvement. She had to register as a sexual predator. With her professional reputation ruined by Joe's television appearance and the trial, the best she could do was take a low-level clerical job with the Fulton County Highway Department. Although Izzy visited her occasionally, Robert never returned her calls and steadfastly refused to acknowledge that she was even alive. She lived in a small rented apartment in the old part of Albany, where, with the exception of the cat she adopted, she led a solitary life. She never sold photographs. Instead, she placed them on the walls of her tiny apartment as a reminder of what she had lost. She died alone at the age of 68 and was buried in a cemetery in suburban Guilderland. The tombstone was small, and other than her name, the date of her birth, and the date of her death, there was nothing on it except the words, bride, mother, lover. Morgana was also sentenced to 5 years in a U.S. federal prison for violating the Mann Act. During her imprisonment, she was repeatedly beaten by her fellow inmates, who simply could not stand her holier-than-thou attitude and arrogant way of treating people. When she was finally released, she was deported back to Canada and barred from entering the United States. She had to register as a sexual predator in Canada. Neither Jennifer nor Izzy ever came to see her. Robert was able to restore his relationship with his father. It took several years, but once the disease was healed, they enjoyed a close father-son bond that lasted for the rest of his father's life. His father was there to see Robert get married and have a daughter, then another daughter, and then a son. Robert loved his family and was even able to accept Izzy back into his life. Izzy spent many years in therapy, dealing with the deception and illness that was her mother's life. She managed to get a job at Altamont Elementary School as an English teacher. It was there that she met and then married another teacher. He taught math and coached the boys' soccer team. He was partially disabled, having lost a leg during combat in Desert Storm Roman II. Izzy found solace in his simple concept of right and wrong, black and white. Although they had no children of their own, they loved their nieces and nephew. She was even able to establish a relationship with her real father, Joe. Her therapist, and more so her husband, helped her understand the kind of person Joe had always been, and she blossomed with the clarity that came into her tormented mind. And Joe, well, Joe had his problems. Yes, he had children again, and the illness that was his previous life was resolved. But he never found a woman he could love as much as he loved Jennifer. He had female companions in his remaining years, but did not have the emotional connection he felt with Jen. But his boilers and turbines were always nearby. They still talked to him and told him their stories. He remained the old man when problems arose in the workplace, and even when he finally retired, he was still called upon when the situation reached a dead end. Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one.